Hello everyone, today I would like to make an introductory video about the ethnic origins of Europe. This is meant really to be an introductory lesson, we can say. It's very resounding, but I'm not so arrogant to conceive that. But let's say an introduction to we can say to medieval history, but that can fit also for ancient history broadly meant, but really looking at the ethnic construction of Europe in itself. And it's not going to be really a polemical video. I know that videos about the origins, the ethnicities, all this controversial stuff, maybe with a picture that, makes people with certain phenotypes that are evidently, provoking in terms of racial problems today and all, are very popular on the internet. It's very easy to make clickbait with that and views. I would like really to get rid of that rubbish and really to go a bit more into a comprehensive picture of the ethnical composition of Europe, which really meant not just from a genetical point of view, but more from an ethnical point of view broadly meant, essentially a cultural one. Um, relatively to this, we have first of all to focus on the really the broader picture, because when we study in the ancient era or the Middle Ages, we as Westerners we end unavoidably, at least in this time in history, historiographically speaking, to look at Europe and the Mediterranean point. I noticed that in medieval history people tend to privilege Northern Europe in general because maybe British historiography that was most influential obviously had that northern perspective, and people tend to forget how the Mediterranean was really even more developed and more important in historical significance compared to Northern Europe. With the ancient world, you can't do that because basically the ancient world was told to us, historically speaking, by Southerners, the Greeks, the Romans, and even though eventually the Roman Empire, but also the Greek, the Hellenic empires eventually extended into the Hellenistic empires better in very far. The Westerners came to dominate up to Caledonia, um, um, to India in practice at different ages, and even beyond. And this is also what I would like to concentrate on this video, just to stress that the origins of Europe are not really strictly European from a geographical point of view, which is something that is very significant. At least we don't reason anymore in the old nationalistic perspectives of Bluten und Boden and stuff like that. We know that as Westerners we're basically a mix of those that we call as Aryans, so these Indo-European populations that were that is about whom is still very hotly debated the origin, but that broadly speaking came from the steppes between the Dniester and the Caucasus, and then eventually spread all over the Eurasia, and eventually partly even Africa, because but those were maybe just bands. But I mean, just if you think about the Empire of Alexander of the Romans, they came to dominate into Africa as well, although those were already populations that were a product of the the mix between local pre-Indo-European populations with the Indo-Europeans. Um, and I personally care very much as a Westerner and as phenotypically uh, clearly a Caucasian, maybe not the brightest ones, but in more fair-haired or blue-eyed, but definitely I'm a Caucasian myself, and I kind of take in account these origins as meaningful to me, because I realize that we all descend from various peoples about whom we decide basically not to know anything, because at one point there are certain people who just prefer to idealize their own ancestors in some ways. There are people who, I don't know, just stop to the fact that their ancestors were the Vikings because it's something cool, you know. But it doesn't take into consideration the fact that wherever your origins is, if, there were still there is still an ethnical overlapping, a very thorough mix, and if you cross-sect your genes, you could see that you are the result of millions of history of evolutions of people who, in much more recent times, but still significant times, came essentially from Africa and eventually spread everywhere. But still, I think that talking about Aryan history, Caucasian history, whatever you want to call it, devoid of any racist meaning, is extremely important today to understand the real Western identity. We could say maybe the European identity best, not meant from a national geographical point of view, but European meant as Aryan in practice. I mean, this, you can be European in this sense even if you are American or Australian. It doesn't matter. What I mean is that you have this ancient you're essentially a Caucasian. You speak an Indo-European tongue. You have traditions and views and perception of the world that are definitely influenced by values of that stem from those peoples, and this is what I really care about, because we know that culture is something very floating. I'm not a communitarist. I'm not anything that end in ist, essentially. But it is also true, and I say that as a medievalist. Oh yes, I am a medievalist, but I don't like medievalism as such. That's what I meant, ideologically speaking. I think it's very important to recognize the common origins of the Europeans from something that goes beyond Europe itself, and that really stems from these Caucasian steppes, a very obscure time in history comprehended from 4000 to 1000 BC, before eventually these people set off and went to populate large parts of Eurasia, to form our still Indo-European identities. Europeans, for instance, have much in common, I don't know, with the Iranians, or with many people who still live in the steppe, even with many Anatolians. Indeed, there is a sort of Indo-European identity that goes beyond Europe, and that really started at that point, in my opinion. And these peoples really, we don't know very much about their origins. By the way, I wanted to finish the concept that I began before, that is about the origins as a medievalist. What to me are why are Indo-European origins so important? Because definitely I think that we still live very influenced by, for instance, chivalric ethics. This is something we might not recognize in everyday life, but things like, I don't know, giving your seat to a woman on the bus, or you know, being nice and gracious in some form, are all, or courageous or proud, and all these are all things that maybe are positive, that definitely came from natural behaviors that seem right, and they're functional to preserving society in substance. But definitely in the West, as well as in other countries that maybe we don't consider Western, as Iran, as I was mentioning before, even others, really stemmed from the chivalry, and chivalry was extremely influenced by Indo-European identity and traditions. And if you wanna, this is a very thought-provoking idea. I know that probably I can't say most of you, but at least many of you, maybe if they don't disagree, they definitely say, what is he talking about?" And I made a video relatively to this that is called I don't even remember. Let me just check now that it kind of addresses this thing from mostly from a military point of view and the birth of chivalry as such in Europe. This was, by the way, a video in which I still said chivalry instead of chivalry, so one cannot say I do not progress. So if you go back there, it's entitled "The Origins of European Chivalry, an Interpretation," and you can go check that out. It can help you to really understand what I mean by saying that that we still live in the with the very heavy influx of Indo-European traditions still today. And what is interesting, I think, about the Indo-Europeans, among their kind of unicity that people, maybe some with not extremely good intentions, want to stress, is the fact that they definitely had their own identity that eventually came to define the languages, the identities that we have. And you can easily see that in the sense that they spoke a different language already at that time from other peoples, mostly the one of Turkic stock that still dwelled around. And this is exactly what I want to stress, is that the Indo-Europeans came from from the Eurasian steppes, which were populated, by the way, by other populations that eventually kind of intermingled even with the Indo-Europeans, especially during the migration era, where lots of energies were really unleashed in this sense by the shift of many peoples moving back and forth from every side of the steppe, from the borders of hence China to the one of the Roman Empire, or the Sassanid Empire. But that ended up to mix pretty much. Sometimes when we talk about the Turks of the Middle Ages, like the Seljuks or all, or even the Huns previously, we assumed that these were because of certain popular culture misunderstanding, that these were Turkic point. So they were not white. They were kind of they were different phenotypically from the Westerners, and they weren't. But as a matter of fact, most of them were also of Indo-European origin. As far as we know, it doesn't really make sense in the steppe to claim from a certain point onwards, especially these were Ural-Altaic, and these are Ural-Altaic, and then these are Indo-Europeans. There was a pretty heavy mix that began to occur actually during the same Indo-European migrations, because as we were saying before, at least according to the Kurganic theory that is still the prevalent, as far as I know, into historiography, the Indo-Europeans eventually expanded from this Ukrainian steppes essentially into or even a bit eastwards into India, into Germany, into Italy, even into China, into Anatolia, into Greece, and all. And they gave birth essentially to the cultures that even we study as and this is well, more of that later, but for now just wanted now to go on. And what was characteristic of these populations, Indo-Europeans and not, that basically gravitated in this climatic band of warm temperate climatic band of the northern hemisphere, stretching from the Mediterranean to the eastern Chinese Sea were usually settled into large plains that basically I'm sorry, I wasn't talking about the Indo-Europeans. I was really talking about the other populations that existed in here that were, however, in strong contact with the Indo-Europeans about the very ancient history of I don't know, the Middle East, of Europe. Um, it's very difficult to say at which point certain populations we were mixed or not. We have actually a lot of problems most of the times, even in identifying the actual ethnical origin of such population. For instance, today, excuse me, we give for granted normally that the Hittites were were Indo-European, but there are other peoples like the Sea peoples that we don't really know much about. We don't know certain populations like the Etruscans, the Ligurians, the Basques, where the hell they came from and whether they were Indo-European or not. And there is basically just speculation about this, even though yes, there are certain prevalent theories, but no definitive answer. But these answers are not definitive exactly because we acknowledge that there were intersections between Indo-Europeans and non-Indo-Europeans, and therefore we can't really understand what it was like. You know, genetical evidence is extremely scarce. It's very difficult to find a grave from that time extrapolating the genome and all. And even when you have, it's such a scanty material that it's never gonna be enough to form a structural picture of how things really were at the time. So we mostly fare over things like, as I was saying before, ethnically broadly meant, that is from a cultural point of view, that are very interesting because they don't really give you a dimension of who was who in genetical terms, but it really shows you how eventually the Indo-Europeans had a very big impact over, culturally speaking, rather than demographically, over the pre-Indo-European populations that existed into Europe, and how these basically began to form to develop a culture that was essentially partly syncretic, obviously, but it's still so into the dominating culture of the invaders, the real one. If you take like Vedic India, that even gave rise to the modern Indian civilization, it is definitely something that was heavily influenced, at least, or even based on basically what the Indo-Europeans had brought in there. And sometimes the Indo-Europeans actually carried out pretty violent conquests, and there is all this theory that is very debated actually about whether the Indo-Europeans were divided into castes for which their the political entities that they created into the sedentary Europe in this warm climatic band populated by many other people actually was centered over the even the ethnical dominance of the conquerors over the vanquished. And this is something probably very obscure about Indo-European history. There is all the theory of the tripartite society of like the workers, the priests, and the warriors, giving a great emphasis on this warlike character of the Indo-Europeans that were essentially shepherds. I mean, they were nomads or semi-nomads, so they had very they had developed in a tribal militarized fashion that is typical of the nomads, because essentially the only way in the environments where they live to acquire new power is to dominate one another, and not plug in the land like you can do, I don't know, in the Fertile Crescent or in the Nile Valley. Um, Even though, as we know, the Indo-Europeans eventually settled down to at a point, but the idea is that the freeman was a warrior, and that he had this love for freedom in practice, that it was very ideal, because all these populations were dominated by aristocracies, by the way, in a less stratified and structural way than definitely the great civilizations of Egypt, of Mesopotamia, or India. um, for socioeconomical dynamics that I think are pretty evident, that I often talk about in my videos. Um, but they definitely maintained this warrior ethics that was definitely very really based on the idea that the conqueror basically had the right to conquer and to rule over those who he had vanquished, which is very dark indeed, but it is a bit at the base of all the warrior societies. Mm, and it is interesting, therefore, to see how eventually this was conjugated with local traditions, but at the same time, to spot how Indo-Europeans were so um, actually very culturally influenced. And this is something that happens usually when there is not a great resistance from local societies. We can say that Europe definitely, and especially the Eurasian steppes, maintained a more fierce um, Indo-European character, probably because there were less populated areas compared to India, Egypt, Mesopotamia, that at the time were really the great demographical basins of the world, together with China. And But the Indo-Europeans didn't make it to China proper, if not certain desertic areas like the Tocharians did in the west of China. Um, and not that they didn't have an influence on China. The Han heavy cavalry was drawn from the Tocharians. Definitely the heavenly war horses of the Tocharians were quite famous, actually, in the sense that there was all a culture that stressed the importance of cavalry warfare, hence chivalry, even in the West in many ways. It stemmed from there. But this idea of the um, cultural domination of an elite that eventually is able um, to 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 spread its own values and ethics on the rest of the population, something you can find easily also in the early Middle Ages. I mean, if you look at, especially at the history of, because it's very easy, let's say, to anglicize Britain, or to francicize northern Gaul, because there are a few people who are there. But even when you see that, I don't know, Italy or Spain, that were much more heavily populated, and that when the Germans arrived, there were very few compared to the local population, and yet, culturally speaking, they were extremely influential. Like, you can argue that Italy in the 8th century was fully Lombard, not from a genetical point of view, because the Longobards were like the maximum of 3% of the world population of the Italian peninsula when they came. But still, everybody at that point considering himself a Lombard and shared a substantial part of their culture. And this usually happens into those cultures that are not very stratified. And definitely with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the highly structural society in of the Roman times had collapsed, and had allowed, in this sense, from a social point of view, to kind of a sort of an osmosis of the Romanized populations to eventually merge with the Germanic ones. And it's not surprising in this sense that where the collapse was greater, like in Italy, the Germanization, culturally speaking, was much greater. And not because it was imposed by the Germans, but because it was the same local populations that looked more favorably at those freemen warriors models than to the ones of the ancient slaves or colons breaking their backs in latifundia that didn't exist anymore, by the way. In Spain, even though the local traditions, especially during the Crusades and all, was reinforced as a sort, like as if the Iberians were Visigoths in practice, which also demographically is not the case. Um, um, Yet the situation was different because the Roman society had remained more standing, and therefore that in turn caused, if anything, more of a Romanization of the Visigoths than a Germanization of the Iberians. These seem a bit theoretical concepts, but actually they're very important, and they explain why the Caucasians, the Aryans, had such a very strong impact eventually on the European cultures that even developed having mix with locals, with local pre-Indo-European populations. If you look at the early Romans, they have a very strong, actually, Indo-European culture, even though Italy had already known substantial civilization before, at least for Western European standards. So the same goes for Hellenic mythology. If you look at the Greek pantheon, you find all these divinities with blonde hair, blue eyes. Even if you think about the Roman Latin onomastics, you find names like Flavus, Rufus, and all that are astonishing. They're all referred to these fair-haired people. That evidently is a relic of the Caucasian past, because these Caucasians were they seemingly had underwent in the steppes at a certain point a sort of a genetic mutation for which like 70% of them had blue eyes, were quite fair-haired, and that's where white people essentially come from. Caucasians come from today, and why we call them white people Caucasians. I think these are all very important things because they show you that really the core of Europe doesn't come from something that eventually developed into Europe, that was primigenial, and that came from this common core where even of pre-Indo-Europeans, because you know that the Indo-European peoples eventually, even in timeline, are those who are eventually already split, like the Celts, the Italics, the Scythians, and all. Um, th- um, but there was a period before into which these peoples were basically all together, that they had not differentiated, so they were technically pre-Indo-Europeans, and it doesn't practically even make sense to say, these were quite similar. There are the famous mummies that were found into China, I don't remember where. These Tocharian mummies that seemingly had very I'm searching for I think it were the Wuzun, probably. I don't remember if those were the mummies that yeah, that these are corpses that have been amazingly preserved by the local very dry environment of their burials into Chinese deserts, and they gave to us back the certain clothes with which these people had been buried in, and seemingly the patterns were of these the motives of these tissues, these textiles, were extremely close to Celtic um, fabrics and textiles, which tells you, and they probably weren't Celtic at all. Probably they were just Tocharians, or maybe they were a group of pre-Celts that, I don't know, went together with them, something like that. but just for saying that at the beginning they were all equal, so we don't have to be even so much surprised that these populations existed over there and they were so akin with each other. By the way, the Tocharians are very interesting in this sense because eventually the Indo-Europeans split in two. The Westerners that were the ones who essentially dwelled into Europe, into sedentary Europe. And then the eastern ones, the one of the so-called Iranian peoples, not because they came from Iran, but if anything because they gave the name to Iran, and that were like the Scythians, the Sarmatians, that remained eventually nomadic. And usually in the eastern part, especially in Asia, they're almost all Iranian peoples, and yet the Tocharians instead seemingly were part of the western half, and they were paradoxically the ones who traveled the easternmost and arriving up to China. These are very fascinating things. You can check them out. I'm not an expert, unfortunately, but they're extremely fascinating to me. The relation with which essentially the Indo-Europeans had interacted with with the local, let's say, the sedentary populations were quite varied, quite at times quite difficult, because there is the eternal clash between the nomad and the sedentary, of the shepherd and the peasant. There is an inherent enmity between these peoples. But hey, we are human beings, so we can slaughter each other as easily as we can bond, befriend with each other. So the obvious consequence is that our culture is essentially an hybrid of these two kind of populations eventually. Also because the Europeans at one point settled down, as we were saying, even though if there were also for socio-economical terms even into what was largely sedentary Europe, a time in which even the Indo-Europeans that have stopped their march, their migration, were still semi-nomadic. If you take Germany, I don't know, the Germans were largely semi-nomadic still at the time of Augustus, let's say, because simply the local environment could not make them sustain something larger, as it happened, I don't know, in Gaul, for instance, among the Celtic Gauls. Even the nomadic lifestyle in this sense lived on for a very long time. It was refueled by during the migration era. I talk about these things in a video I made, which is called, I believe, The Beginning of the Migration Era, into which I explain practically how the migration era didn't really start at the end of the late Roman Empire. It was something inherent. The nomadic tradition, the nomadic lifestyle societies were kind of average outside the borders of the empire, even into Europe. We mentioned the Germans, but if you take, I don't know, certain Thracian populations, certain other, I don't know, there are many cultures actually that existed even east of Germany, or that eventually came to be mixed usually with those peoples of the steppes. So there was this continuous injection at some point of even a re-nomadization of the populations. Like when the Germans began during the late empire to move, well, they had been largely they were semi-nomadic, but they had been kind of largely sedentary for several centuries. At a certain point, they put themselves on march once again, and they nomadized in many ways. Think about the Goths, or what we think were originally Germans. The Gothic origins are actually pretty disputed, but you can find that, I don't know, with other populations like the Vandals, the Burgundians, the Longobards, the same Goths indeed. These were populations that eventually kind of moved east they kind of got nomadized in part, and they came back into sedentary Europe in a much more nomadic, with a much more nomadic culture than one that they had just, I don't know, 200 years before. And that happened also partly because they had mixed with the Sarmatians, with other populations that, on the contrary, they were going towards them in order to escape the Hunnic advance and all. So it really happened this way, and in a certain sense it was normal for these people who lived outside of the Roman borders to perceive themselves as potentially on the march. Even when the Romano-Germanic kingdoms were formed, there was still the perception among the Germanic ruling classes that, or at least the ruling classes of Germanic tradition, because obviously there was also a lot of intermarrying between Romans and Goths, and Germans, but they were perfectly aware that they had come from a certain point from Scandinavia, that they all came from there as Germans, that they could come back. Many peoples, the Germanic peoples that didn't make it during the migration era, basically came back to Scandinavia. Even if they had not dwelled in there from centuries at the time that they had put themselves on the march. And this is so very interesting because it tells you how it was really strongly perceived, a common origin. It wasn't probably perceived a common identity, but it was definitely perceived a common origin, about which unfortunately we don't know excessively much, but that did definitely exist. And and the so relatively to the Indo-European migrations, and this is just for the sake of being, complete, these peoples eventually scattered of everywhere at one point. Some of them went into Central Europe, and that's where eventually the Germans, the Celts, the Italics, the Greeks, even the Lusitanians, the I don't know, the Dacians, other populations basically spread. Yes, the Latins, for instance, did come from Central Eastern Europe. We know that. We don't even know how they were named, but they came from there. The same goes for the Hellenic civilization. Basically, it started from the interaction between these Mycenaeans and the newcomers of the north. With the Celts, it was the same. Eventually, the Celts had a further expansion in 3rd century and 2nd century BC. They reached up to the British Islands, the northern Spain, to today's Bulgaria, to Anatolia. Think about the Galatians. They really went far away. The Germans, seemingly or the Proto-Germans at this point, since a very early age, had migrated into Scandinavia. Probably when it was warmer than what it was later. And then from there they began, in fact, once again to go down, to push, well, not really when it was I mean, I don't really know where it was colder or warmer. Actually, it seems that the further Germanic expansion that eventually was done at the expenses of the Celts, mostly, into today's Germany proper, um, because like at the time of Augustus, the Germans arrived in the south up to the river Main, like today's Bavaria and southern Germany in general, south of the Danube, were Celts. Um, uh, but I mean, they were slowly coming down from Scandinavia, seemingly for climate warming that had basically pushed, as it was natural in semi-nomadic populations Indo-European origin to be the only way which these peoples expanded. If there wasn't enough food for anyone, the the young males every spring at every year were sent away as warriors, essentially to go take their own land and to go somewhere else, and that's the reason how they how the Indo-Europeans were so used to expand, and these traditions were actually pretty alive even in moments to which these populations had sedentarized. I mean, this is what the German Comitatus was about. This is what the Celts did. This is even what the Italics did up to a very recent point before the Roman conquest in itself, because those were the Latins were richer guys and eventually built up cities like Rome and all. While the other populations of the Italian Apennines were kind of tribal in their own way. So there is all something in common that these populations had. Some in the east arrived far as Turkestan, as China, as we were saying. Other Indo-European populations settled into Anatolia and in Iran. Think about the Hittites that we were mentioning before. They were Indo-Europeans. Think about the Persians. The Hellenic historiography wanted to stress the difference between the Greeks and the Persians. I can say it was mostly a cultural difference, and therefore today we picture the Persians like the average, you know, Islamic terrorist guy of the situation, and the Greeks as the pure, noble Indo-Europeans. But actually, if there were Aryans, it would have been more likely to be into the Persian army with all the populations that they drew from the steppes as allies than in the Greek army. It was at the time of the Persian Wars, it was already pretty heavily ethnically mixed with the Mediterraneans, pre-Indo-Europeans. Pre-Indo-European populations, and definitely the Persian Achaemenid Empire stemmed from the Medi, from populations who were like, I don't know, the Parthians, like the Scythians. I mean, there were people who dwelled in the steppes, semi-nomadic, that eventually settled into Iran and created this magnificent empire that it was the marvel of human civilization at the time. This happened also in the Indus and Ganges Valley, and it gave birth to the extremely fascinating Vedic culture that is also Indo-European. So as we were saying, also into the Italian peninsula, into the southern Balkans and all. So the amazing thing of this is that still in the languages that are still spoken into these areas, into these regions, you find names that are essentially the same. There was definitely a moment in our history into which the cultural dominance of the Hellenic and of the Latin language brought to a new intermingling of new mix of the vocabularies. I mean, take modern English is, it has like half of the words come from either Greek or Latin. But if you really take the languages that were spoken at the time, so with all the various peoples separated, you see that in Latin, pater is like the English father. It's like, I'm sure also in Indian it's like pater, something like that. I mean, there are names that they're the same names because these were the same people. They came from the same place, from the same population, we had the same customs, same languages. And this is also, by the way, extremely present in the history of religions. History of religion is beautiful. If you ever get the chance to study the religions, to read a compared study all the Indo-European religions, you understand that these guys, there are the same divinities, essentially. Like Thor is Hercules in practice, and the Mitra was one of the Dioscuri in practice. These are all mixed. The symbolisms are always there. The names are the same, and sometimes it's impressive because it's as if it seems like we are really the same people. We speak the same language in practice. So relatively to this, there was definitely also great interaction between and a great syncresis with those more, especially the more largely influent non-Indo-European civilizations that existed at the time. Um, think about those Semitic civilizations that were developing floridly into Mesopotamia, Syria, Palestine, um, or a Comedic origin like Egypt, um, and even those populations that we meant before, like the Etruscans, that we don't know really where they came from in practice. Some say from Anatolia. It's a more likely explanation, but really what is important is that the Indo-Europeans came basically at the margins or even in the midst of such peoples. So they in turn absorbed much of their cultures. We were talking about the Persians. Well, the Persians, yeah, as ruling dynasties, they might have been of Indo-European origin, but definitely they drew heavily from the previous civilizations like the Assyrians, the case of Persia, but even if you take Greece, the idea of the polis, for instance, of the city-state is definitely not Indo-European. The Indo-Europeans were warrior tribesmen. They were semi-nomadic. They didn't want anyone to wage basically to become a name of a city in enclosed walls. They all lived scattered in practice or just federated into coalitions. The city-state is a typical Mesopotamian model, and eventually was inherited by the Hellenic populations. It was inherited by Rome. As we were saying, was quite different still from the Italics that lived in a very few kilometers from them into the Apennine hinterland. So there were definitely very, very strong and very evident intersections that existed at all times, and our Western civilization also owes to these the real nature, the real character of our identity. The idea of republic is something inherently rooted into our culture. What is it really? It's really a mix between the Indo-European ideals of freedom, of individual freedom, and the acceptance of some joint centralized rule that has to exist to ensure like the minimal, I don't know, like police or something like that. And it all comes back from this world of our own. Then as Westerners, also Christianism, Judaism, that definitely influenced our societies. And Islam, if you consider in fact that, I don't know, the Turks, the Anatolian peoples, or the Persians that were originally Indo-European, because the Turks were really a minority compared to the Anatolian population had been heavily influenced by the Indo-Europeans, as we have seen. They got Islamicized, so even that branch today is not considered Western, mostly because of that. With Turkey, we see a greater westernization. With Iran, we say sometimes, and yet we consider maybe in the Westerner countries like Japan, while not a Westerner, countries like Brazil, sometimes at least. Um, just for saying that that sometimes it seems we're pretty much confused about what really Western means, especially from a strictly modern history perspective, because really the idea of Europe and Western culture is something that was developed, in my opinion, in the modern age, especially in opposition against the Ottoman Empire from the Westerners, and that really affects us very strongly today. But even up to the Middle Ages, there was definitely a concept of Europe, but it was something much broader and influenced both by Christianism, but partly also from other cultures, philosophies, conceptions coming from the East and all. But just for saying that, in my opinion, what we really can find as a common base, really, in Western identity is really this Caucasian origin from a cultural point of view. Um, our models, our faults and our virtues. I mean, I'm not saying that this is something extremely positive, but I just like to acknowledge that, historically speaking. Like, if as a Westerner, if you really wonder what you are, I think you have to look past very much everything and reach up to that. Also because Western culture was extremely receptive of, as we were saying, of external cultures, of philosophies, of religions, of political systems, and all. So what remains in common, according to me, is that one. So other people will say, well, but there is also the Greek thought that is pretty much a turn point. Yes, it is really true. That shouldn't be forgotten in the sense that I believe the Hellenic world and the Hellenic philosophies were definitely the ones who um, made the West something else compared to the East. And maybe this is true, and that's already a big difference. But I would say that, I don't know, the Germanic populations that invested Europe during the migration era, they surely didn't read, they surely weren't Greek philosophers. So in this sense, I believe that also Western Europe and maybe its Celtic, Germanic and Italic background was a bit different from the one that, I don't know, Eastern Europe, including the Greece, the Dacians, the Iranian peoples of the steppes. Um, in some ways, I mean, there was already a differentiation in this sense that definitely Greek thought brought us something that nobody had or brought. The Greeks basically began to reason really in a modern sense. You have to think that before the Greeks, basically the word was conceived like, I don't know, I look at that tree, and that tree is like, it's not a tree, it's that particular tree. Like, it has all its own um, characteristics. There are spirits living in there. It's that tree and only that one, and it's not equal to others. And the gods have a particular preference for that compared to another, and it has all a value of its own. The Greeks were the folks who basically began to say, um, is there a common category for making that fitting as a tree? And in the moment in which you do that, you immediately erase basically the inherent value of that still. I don't know even how to call it, a sort of polytheistic conception of the diversity of every single thing. And the Greeks instead began to reason into scientific categories as we think of them. Maybe not exactly as today, because I think that the Greeks were much more subtle in this sense. I mean, the way we conceive categories today is much more deriving from the 18th century French encyclopedia, then which is just a plain disillusioned approach to reality, like as if the problem was really only finding the right category and then you can fit everything in there. The Greeks instead were really giving the sap to this by saying, is there really a way to do so? So really pushing the mind to work that out instead of just being like today as babies that we're simply told what to think or do on the basis of an encyclopedical categorization. And the Greeks were really the guys who made the step forward on their own as individuals, and that definitely had a huge impact into our civilization. And it's arguably what the Westerners, I don't know this, because eventually, Greek thought heavily influenced even Islamic civilizations, and philosophies. So you can't really say that. Aside from certain approach towards the divinity that are probably in the sense less they're probably more tied to, well, I don't want to exceed now, but let's say that also the Islamic thought is a son of the Greeks in practice. So what's Westerner at this point? Like the Greeks were over by the time the Arabs were getting educated on their books. There were the Byzantines. There were still Romans, politically speaking, but not really the Hellenic Greeks that existed before. And the Europeans in the West had still to be schooled, by the way, by the same Arabs through Aristotle and all the Greek legacy that arrived from there. So at that point, it's as if Christianity and Islam were intellectually speaking, a bit of the same origins, and it's a challenging perception in this sense that I'd like also to dip in one day. But for now, I just think I've been talking more than enough. And I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or simply subscribe to my channel if you want to receive further news about my contents. For now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye!